Professor Haraway, I am most delighted that you are willing to share your thoughts with us here at the Documenta in Kassel by means of this short interview. As an introduction, 2 words should be more than enough, by which I mean just mentioning your name, Donna Haraway, but also as a means to start up our conversation. It should be mentioned that both life and art, concepts very central to the Yes Naturally project and to our involvement in Kassel, have been on top of your agenda for a long time and have actually been a major inspiration, or rather the major inspiration for this project. Thus, we are very pleased to have you here and to discuss some of the artworks we consider to be important in their entanglements with your academic work. This is all very much in line with what the General Secretary of the 13th Documenta, this is Miss Caroline Christoph Bakagiev, has stated. And she said, Documenta should not be an exhibition as it was before, but a state of mind. So, I'll start with my first question now, which is keeping this statement of Christoph Bakagiev in the back of our mind, that the Documenta is really about the state of mind. I would like to ask you how this aesthetic state of mind is at work in your current writings. And 2 examples come to my mind immediately. First of all, Patricia Piccinini's Companion Species, and second, Baila Goldenthal's String Figures. So what is the state of mind that they evoke?
Okay, that's a really rich and deep question. And as you know, Patricia Piccinini's companion figures in relation to environmental crises in threatened species in Australia had gotten my attention, partly because they were slightly frightening alien species. They were not altogether comforting. They also were provocative, maybe a little ironic. They were both serious and not easy to pin down. They invited me anyway, and I think most of the people who might have seen those installations, those amazing life-size aliens, silicone and hair figures that were somehow designated protectors for Earth species, they invited me to a kind of rethinking what it might mean to companion, accompany, protect, be endangered, what's living, not just what's life in art, but what's vulnerability, living and dying, taking certain kinds of risks to accompany or to be for some ways of life rather than others. So there was a kind of interrogative quality that required an engagement that you can't know in advance. You don't know what to do in advance of engaging and being at risk. And I think of Baila Goldenthal's String Figures, the ways that she does those really fascinating workings of cat's cradle string figures, again, as provocations to not just connecting, but how to connect, how to relay patterns. Isabel Stenger's looked at some of the thinking I had been doing about string figures or cat's cradles as figures for engaging in Terran worlding. And she said she was riffing off of Guattari and then riffing off of me, and I'm riffing off of her. She says to do string figures, you have to somehow pass on patterns, take the risk of your hands being passive to receive a pattern, as well as to pass on some kind of knot or line that wasn't there before. You both inherit patterns, as in string figures, but you invent and pass on and take the risk of passion as well as action, of bearing as well as doing. That there's a way of engaging in the world that I think of as part of art, philosophy, biology, or really part of being an earthling. That is action and passion, being not just living, but living and dying.
And as I hear you talk about it, this concept of kind of being open to either companion species or string patterns or whatever is very important. The moment of opening yourself up to these.
Yes. And the companion species is not a synonym for the good or for harmony, or it's not a synonym for anything. It's an interrogative. It's a provocation for responsibility and being at risk together with. So in that sense, it's not a traditionally humanist stance, although it engages human capacities, I think, deeply. It's not anti-human, but it is not conventionally humanist in the sense of human beings as the only source of response or value, or indeed thinking. It's a kind of becoming with in a way that feels inescapable. It feels incredible. It feels so profoundly necessary.
Okay. This then brings me very nicely to the second question that I had in mind, which in which I have a statement from Natalie Jeremienko, who's also one of the artists involved in this project. And she gave in the Cross Species Adventures Club, she stressed that she was interested in truth and in science not having the monopoly on truth. Throughout your career, you have in many ways shown us that the limits of science and the impossibility. You have in many ways shown us the limits of science and the impossibility of objectivity. And in that sense, I think this links nicely to how, for instance, the work of Piccinini and of Goldenthal kind of opens this up. Also in this project, we have a few artists, like, for instance, Angelo Vermeulen and Adam Zaretsky, who I think you've seen their work. And they seem to be practicing a similar kind of strategy. Their aesthetics rethinking of concepts like nature and technology and life seem to place serious question marks with the way in which these concepts have been largely accepted in scientific writing. So my question now is more about how do we involve the scientists in this? How do we involve the scientists in, for instance, these artworks and in what art can do? And then we can go back to the artworks that you have been struggling with over the past few years, but also in how this now has been at work in Yes Naturally and in Kassel.
Yeah. First, I'd like to say something that's been important to me, I think, all along about truth-telling and about objectivity. Partly because from the beginning I've been in love with science and not against it.
Yeah.
And see objectivity not as an epistemological position, but a precious and fragile and partial achievement with grappling hooks for attachment sites. And that it's not that I'm somehow arguing against objectivity as against objectivity, against a capital O. You see what I mean? That there is a kind of fetishization of scientific truth-telling that acts to close it off from engagement, even among the sciences and among scientists. And it's the kind of opening up of attachment sites that I feel like my work is part of. And that includes the attachment sites among organisms, artists, biologists, physicists, climatologists, policy people, walkers, people who want a place to walk that isn't a blasted and destroyed place. Parrot might move into Cologne and take up parakeets and take up residence, even though they don't belong there, or horses in the U.S. Southwest who the Spanish conquistadors brought, but then somehow have a place in not just the national imaginary of the U.S. state, but have a place that matters, that can't be reduced to some kind of doctrine of purity or who originated where and belongs in that place and no other. On the other hand, not everything belongs everywhere. So how do we tell a kind of ethically accountable truth with each other, including other organisms and rocks and landscapes. What does truth-telling look like in the worlds that we are responsible for now? And I think of artists like Natalie Jeremijenko and her robotic dogs and urban toxicity sensing projects that, in this particular case, make use of totally synthetic organisms. I mean, literally off the shelf, as much as possible off the shelf, modified components to make dog-like critters that go walking with urban kids in polluted environments, to engage civic conversations, to somehow make a difference in who gets to live in that landscape. Microbes, worms, raccoons, maybe also street dogs, people. The robotic dogs become real players in the building up of an organic conversation, so that nature cultures are engaged, and all the players, the players are both other actual organisms, synthetic organisms, soils, rocks, people, city councils. And I think of artists like Natalie, who after all is also an engineer, hardly someone who is against science, quite the opposite. Natalie is an artist and an engineer, as in many ways is Beatrice da Costa, others who I care about, who engage their whole beings in some kind of way to propose a kind of nature cultures where what is to be on this earth and in this place, like this street corner in the Bronx, what is to be is at stake. And it matters. It matters who does what. Cynicism is not an acceptable position in the face of the crises that we're in. But staying with the trouble involves aesthetic, cognitive, literary, engineering, affective and cognitive depth. In that these artists who don't do, they perform, they exhibit, they risk themselves with materialities and skills that they might not have engaged before. They're perfectly willing to try something on that doesn't work. These artists are artful, and they. I was listening. Maybe you know this really interesting performance artist, monologuist called the Reverend Billy. Who calls himself Rev Billy. He's a he's a preacher. He engages the apparatus of, say, Jimmy Swaggart and the right wing evangelical Christian preaching apparatus to convict us of the Holy Spirit in what he calls the Church of No Shopping, or a kind of Earth Alleluia or Hallelujah. Or Hallelujah. It has all the moves.
But this is kind of, what he's after, and I think that is also what we see in Natalie's work and in many other of these artists who have really strong backgrounds. I think practically all of them have very strong sympathies for science, but they are in search for like the margins of science. So to come up with this
contact zones, they aren't just margins. They might actually be smack dab in some center. Yeah. I'm not so happy these days with the center margin.
I was just quoting Derrida, but we can use other terms.
Exactly, but I think the spatialities are more interesting than that. Yeah. And I think these artists engage all kinds of spatialities, including center margin work, but they make their conflict contact zones happen in both expected and unexpected places. And their ability and willingness to propose tropes, metaphors that are more inventive than center margin is part of the reason they're so helpful to us. That they're unconvinced by the conventional tropes, I think. And I think many of our philosophers are way too conventional in our toolkits. I include myself in this. That we have the ability to be more sensuous in our cognitive experiments, in our languages, and that the artists are often better at it. Many of them, of course, are also philosophers.
Yeah.
These are not exclusive undertakings.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay.
And so I think of people like Natalie and Beatrice and Mark Dion and many others as as engaging in a kind of speculative fabulation and expérience in both the scientific and artistic sense.
Experiment with science, yeah.
Well, expérience in the French sense, which is also always...
Experience, yeah. Both ways.
Experience and experiment.
Yeah.
Look, I live in the United States, where some vast proportion of my fellow citizens think global warming is a conspiracy of the left. Yeah. And think organic evolution is optional as a way of relating to the world, who think that intelligent design is a reasonable thing to teach high school kids. I live in the United States where anti-science, anti-intellectualism is a giant threat. Mm-hmm. So people like me dare not be read as anti-scientific without playing into the hand of the most repressive, regressive forces at work in this very dangerous country.
Okay, let me come to question number 3 now. In terms of critique, the state of mind that deserves our attention here wants to move away from this anthropocentrism. Yet in trying to do a more affirmative reading of your work and of what the artists here are after, I would like to say that in the end, the key concept at stake here is life. In When Species Meet, you already practice an activist philosophy when you conclude, and now I quote, pigs have just as much claim on life as a dog, and what about humans? If social, emotional, and cognitive complexity is the criterion, Derrida got it right. There is no rational or natural dividing line that will settle the life and death relations between human and non-human animals. Such lines are alibis if they are imagined to settle the matter technically. In situated knowledges, when talking of the object as an agent, you turn this actually into a very general claim, which is possible for every, which is actual for every possible individuality. So we're not talking now only of humans, of animals, but of every possible object even. And now I have a quote again from situated knowledges. Situated knowledges require that the object of knowledge be pictured as an actor and agent, not as a screen or a ground or a resource. In that sense, I am very interested in your reading of To a Green Ford's Neo Biota. This is also one of the artists that that's part of this project, which is also in search for radically new styles of life. And perhaps this also links nicely to your the claim that you just made about being in search for radically new spaces. So not just for, I use the term margins, which I take from Derrida, but we can use other terms. And I agree with you that the opposition is a bit challenging these days. But I would be very much interested to see how these new spaces, what they have to offer us also in terms of life.
Yes, so much there. First, maybe this is just something that I need to emphasize more recently, because of the way that life can be so easily fetishized. Where what I want life to mean is living and dying and vulnerability and being a Terran critter, a Terran being on Earth and not in the being in always becoming with and at risk and in process with each other, where dying is as important as living, and life matters, but not as capital L life. In other words, I don't think of myself as pro-life thinker.
Yeah, no,
Because
that's
I know
dangerous.
that's conditioned because of the language of the United States,
Yeah.
and because the co-optation of life language by an evangelical right-wing formation, which is particularly powerful here, but not only in the United States. So that maybe I need to really emphasize that life, for me, always means living and dying, killing and nurturing, being at risk to and with each other in a non-innocent way, always non-innocent.
Yeah.
And that the abiotic as well as the biotic are engaged, and not in some grand hallelujah chorus to complexity, but being for some ways of living and dying and not others. I feel that the ethical question is like the old anarchist question: what is to be done? What is it to live and die in a time of exterminations and extinctions and genocides? Because that's where I feel situated, in where situated knowledges are at stake. So I think of the neo-biota as asking actually quite affiliated questions to that. I feel kind of sibling relationship when I look at the video and the audio transmissions of the parrots, where they maybe shouldn't have shown up, but nonetheless flourish. Parrots in a city who become protected species and who are migrants in a city where migration is hardly something to be taken for granted. In a country where maybe the Afro-Germans didn't get to be citizens quite as quickly as the parrots. In culture, I'm not sure. I think that I'm all for the parrots, and there are the parrots at Telegraph Hill in San Francisco too. I think that these artworks are both affirmative in themselves about not fetishizing urban and rural spaces, that who belongs in the city is always at stake, that urban wildlife and urban not so wildlife, that urban companion species are both expected and unexpected. The peregrine falcons will move into skyscrapers and make a living. Formerly endangered species like a red-tailed hawk will make a living off of urban pigeons, who are the rats of the sky. Yeah. The expected and unexpected associations in urban life really need attention. And that I think of Greenford's work as really, really good in focusing a kind of love and questioning and unfamiliarity and a kind of being with, in this case, the parakeets, who provoke a kind of love and discomfort, in part because of, for so many reasons. That I tried to evoke in just that quick riff on Cologne, on Germany, on the whole history of migration, now as well as 50 years ago. And that we are at stake with each other, and these questions of belonging are not settled. And these questions came up in a talk I went to yesterday that Agustin Fuentes gave on macaques in Bali, and particularly in town settings, in contemporary Bali, and the ways that tourist industries are involved in expanding certain kinds of forest in Hindu temples in Bali that might generate several $100,000 a year for the temple community, and whether these long-tailed macaques can or can't expand into an area of the forest, or who belongs where in what is truly a global set of ecological and economic and biological relationships that both have very long-term ecological and evolutionary relationships. In the case of Bali, several thousand years of changing histories of macaque and human species. And what's going on now is both part of that history and quite new, thank you. And new pathogens, for example, brought in by the tourists that become part of the ecology. And perhaps pathogens from the macaques passed on in different ways, both to the tourists and to local people. The multi-species relationships that artists like Greenfork foreground, I think, are where our best thinking and living are at stake. I call it nature cultures just because I don't know what else to say. It's a placeholder.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for this wonderful conversation we had, and for the explanations, and for really thinking through these artworks that are part of Yes Naturally and of Kassel. So, and for taking the time to do this interview across the ocean. So, thanks a lot again.
And do. I wish I could be there, and so have a really fun time. And the more other critters you can get into the event, the better. Get some press passes.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot again.